to be troubled or distressed. The systems didn't have to be under a certain size. So it's pretty broad as long as it's a municipal system. I have slides that Michael's going to make available to everybody with a lot of data on it. But in Pennsylvania, there have been 20 final orders so far. We have 6 cases pending. And I think what I really want to be able to emphasize today is we all tend to look at cases as they come in and as we're dealing with them, but we're seeing the cumulative impact of these fair market value acquisitions. And we've had rate cases by the buyers since the fair market value acquisition. So we're seeing the rate impact as well. So you'll see in the materials, the shortfall, the annual revenue shortfall created by the difference between the rates that the acquired customers are paying and the fair market value or rate base that's set in the application case after 20 cases is about $68 million a year. The pending cases will add another $28.6 million of revenue shortfall every year if they go through as proposed. So I just want to emphasize from a ratepayer impact, there are only so many buckets that these costs can be put into. And what we're seeing is that the acquired customers are seeing large increases, and the existing customers of the buyer are also seeing large increases. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but in Pennsylvania, at least, wastewater revenue requirement can be shifted to water customers. So water customers of the buyer are also seeing increases. So I look forward to our discussions and your questions.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Gary Prettyman, currently with Veolia North America, Senior Director of Rates. I've been doing rates and assorted things like acquisitions for the last 44 years, all in water. Few years of it as a consultant, the rest with a regulated water company. As I do get involved in acquisitions and other regulatory matters before the commissions. Currently, Veolia has 6 regulated states that we have water companies in. Just a little bit of what we look at in an acquisition without going too detailed right now is it a tuck-in or is it further away? Is it distressed or is it okay? How much CapEx does it need? Are there water quality issues? Things like that. But I think really the bigger issue, as we all NARUC companies and commissions want to consolidate these smaller systems, what do we do when the system is mostly developer owned, which means net rate base would be 0 or close to it? What do we do with the rate design? As Christine mentioned, PA allows the cross subsidization, but not all states do. So those are kind of the bigger issues to deal with rather than the acquisition itself. And you have to look at the impact on customers. I'll just add, while I'm thinking about it, all of the comments I'm making are mine and not necessarily those of Veolia.
Very good. Thank you. So let's start with that, kind of what you mentioned there, Gary. As we think about these acquisitions, I mean, we do have a large number of small systems, privately owned. We have smaller municipal systems, and that seems to be where a lot of the acquisitions have been in most cases. Most of those are frequently, assets that have been in place for a long time and are heavily depreciated, may not be running at levels that we might expect or desire from normal industry standards. And as we think about who companies are acquiring, what makes for a good acquisition? Is our particular type of assets? You mentioned tuck-in systems. Are there particular types of assets that are more or less desirable from the industry side? And then I'm going to ask the commissioner and Christine to kind of share from their perspectives how they view that same question as to what are good acquisitions, or what makes a good acquisition?
Well, generally an acquisition that's close, that's a good one. Because you don't necessarily have to hire additional employees. You can cover it with your existing employees. One that is reasonably well run, and doesn't need a tremendous amount, that's not distressed. That would be a good acquisition. Unfortunately, a lot of those small companies, whether it's a small regulated or a municipal, don't necessarily meet those criteria, but still, even with the distress system, if it's close by, it could be a good acquisition because you're ultimately increasing your customer base, which is the ultimate goal, and eliminating, in the bigger picture, the small systems that can't operate well.
Commissioner, from the regulatory side, as you look at this landscape of potential acquisitions and consider the challenges associated with them, where do you see this as being a net benefit in terms of having these large privates come in and make acquisitions, and what kind of asset or portfolios, would you say make a good acquisition?
I think, starting with just eliminating the number of poor performing water and wastewater utilities is obviously a benefit. And I just want to throw out a disclaimer. I mean, I'm a regulator in Indiana, but I'm not the policymaker. People probably don't like this term, but we're policy takers. And so our General Assembly has been really clear that they value dealing with this issue of these small utilities that may be mismanaged or may not be run well, and trying to find creating efficiencies through acquisitions that mean lower operation and maintenance expenses per customer by just spreading these costs out by a bigger group of customers. And I think the end result is just lowering the number of poor performing water and wastewater utilities, which I think is a benefit overall.
Christine?
Yeah, so what I think Gary and the commissioner have both described are what I'll call sort of the traditional regionalization and consolidation that I think a lot of states with a lot of water companies have been dealing with for 35, 40 years. And we've made progress. I mean, when I started 35 years ago, the commission regulated about 400 water systems in Pennsylvania, and that's now below 100. So the consolidation of especially distressed, troubled small systems has been happening for decades, I think, in most places. And in Pennsylvania, we have statutory sections to address those types of acquisitions. We have an acquisition premium statute that you can qualify for if you meet criteria that's targeted solely at these troubled systems. And the commission has the ability to appoint receivers and order takeovers of small troubled systems. The difference in fair market value, I think, is that because at least in Pennsylvania, it does not have to be a troubled system. And I wouldn't characterize any of the 20 so far as being troubled systems. And there may be people out there that disagree with me, but in the traditional sense, these systems have been meeting all the requirements. So in the fair market value is what I'll call sort of a new phase that is regionalization and consolidation, perhaps physically, as Gary described, sometimes not, but it really is coming at a really high cost. And when you start layering that high cost where the customers are not paying their cost of service, then you lose the economies of scale that the commissioner was talking about. So it's just a different way, and we think there are flaws in this particular fair market value statute, but it's not the traditional regionalization and consolidation we've seen for a long time.
Okay, so fair market value is certainly a controversial and kind of a big pressing issue in many jurisdictions. So my understanding is, fair market value is essentially, the price that the market is willing to pay, or the acquirers are willing to pay, based on the economic value of the system that they're acquiring. That's often very different than the book value of the assets that have been depreciated over a long period of time. So there's this potential big difference of, ratepayers have already paid the cost of the infrastructure in some sense and depreciation through their historic rate base. And with fair market value, we're kind of recapitalizing assets that have been depreciated, and those end up back in rate base. So it comes, we get into this tension over how fair market value works. So, what are some of the pressing issues? What are some of the concerns, beyond, I probably oversimplified, the issue at that point, but, as we think about fair market value, why is this such a point of contention, and what are some of the issues that you're most concerned about? And Christine, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, primarily we're concerned with the impact on ratepayers. So if it's a status quo transfer, so from a capable seller to a capable buyer, then we're pretty much looking at the purchase price compared to, in Pennsylvania, the two appraisals, one by the buyer's utility valuation expert and one by the seller. For the most part, I think in all of our cases, the purchase price has been the lesser of the average of the two appraisals. So we use the purchase price for rate making rate base. I will say in Pennsylvania, OCA has sponsored and recommended adjustments to the appraisals, which the commission has accepted some of those. So you'll see in the materials I provided that the proposed rate making rate base has not always been approved by the commission. So we look at the appraisals, but then we look at whether there are affirmative benefits. Pennsylvania is an affirmative benefit state, not a no harm state. So we're looking for those benefits and harms. And what we're seeing is the rate impact, because of the rate making rate base level above the rates that the selling customers are already paying, is causing large increases to the customers of the seller if they bear all the costs, or as I indicated earlier, those costs are going to be shifted to other wastewater or water customers depending on the acquisition. And these are not small impacts. Some are smaller than others, but in some they're pretty large increases. And the customers really are not, it's a status quo transfer. So that rate impact, we try and address it then in the following case. We asked for separate cost of service studies when they filed the first case after acquisition. But there are so many things going on in the rate design aspect of a water case where there are multiple rate zones anyway, that it's very hard to keep under control the rate increases that customers see as a result. So that's our biggest concern. We think there are ways to address that, but it really would take a statutory change. So under the current statutory scheme, we once you approve the rate making rate base, you can't address it in the next rate case. You can only figure out how does it get allocated among the various customers.
Okay. Commissioner Valletta.
I would say our particular statute is pretty similar to Pennsylvania. One thing I would add though is we don't have a whole lot of discretion. So and we could kind of go through this piece by piece. First, we formally had a distressed utility statute, and the statute was changed to offered utilities. I think to be kind of to apply more to like the muni systems that may not be distressed. Sort of what Christine was alluding to is like not all these acquisitions are of distressed utilities. A lot of them are municipalities that no longer want to be in the water or wastewater business, and they have other needs for that money from the sale that they wanted to use, and so they decide to get out of that business. So that would be one of the first changes that we saw. We also have changes to the size. There are some limitations to the acquisition size. So it has to be below 8,000. And once it's above 8,000, it sort of changes the application of the statute and what we're bound by. So it really is kind of on a case by case basis for us. But I would say since the statute changed with fair market value and then the changes that came after that, it really has taken it, a lot of it out of our hands in a sense and turned it into, we're still reviewing the evidence, but I feel like it's more of a much less contentious process than it was before.
Gary, what's been your experience, especially as Veolia is in 6 different jurisdictions? How has this played out for you, and what are your thoughts on that?
The two different questions there.
Answer them both.
Yeah, I will. The only one that I think we've done under fair market value is in Pennsylvania. Followed the rules, it worked out well. We ultimately did acquire that company using the different valuations. But if you consider it, now we're into my thoughts. If you consider the fact that even if it's a well-run system that you're acquiring, there's going to be construction investment needs with just normal upkeep. Then you have lead removal. Now we have PFAS coming down the road. If it's a distress system, that just gets amplified. So you're looking at large increases just on a normal going basis. And now you add on to that the fair market value adjustment, which could be large, just makes the impact on the customer even greater. And how do you spread that around? That's really my concern.
I'm curious. It seems for the investor-owned utilities, there's a little bit of a tension, right? On the one hand, you were worried about rate hikes if the rate base is inflated too much through the fair market valuation. At the same time, investors are putting out X amount of dollars to make the acquisition, and if they're not getting a rate of return on the amount they invest, as opposed to the value of the assets, the book value of the assets they acquire, how might that affect the incentive from kind of an investor's perspective for being interested in some of these acquisitions, especially some of the more difficult ones?
Yeah, well, if it's a fair market value state and investors are, considering that, then they will, generally speaking, earn on that amount, even if it, an original cost state, they'll earn on that. So they know what you're going into with the different acquisitions in the different states. So, you always have the opportunity to earn on it, regardless which state. Of course, the level is different. The bigger question is, what rate base, especially a municipal system, which is generally built by developers, can you actually earn on?
Yeah, Michael, on that issue, my understanding, one of the benefits to the investor owns of having the fair market value statute in Pennsylvania is that by moving that rate base determination into the application case, they get that certainty that they know they will be able to earn a return on that full rate base, rather than waiting until the first rate case after acquisition. So it moves it forward in time. They get the certainty. And at least in Pennsylvania, there's been no differentiation on the return on equity that they earn on the fair market value rate base versus the depreciated original cost. So they're earning that full, or the opportunity to earn that full return on equity that they're getting across all of the rate base, whether it's fair market value or depreciated original cost. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly was, you had mentioned about a buyer and a seller, in negotiations, but at least under the fair market value statute in Pennsylvania, both the buyer and the seller really have an incentive to maximize or have the highest cost. So to me, it's a very different dynamic in negotiations than it might be in any other negotiation that you might have in a marketplace.
We hadn't talked about this ahead of time, but it seems to me that given the differences in the legislation across the different jurisdictions in the country, that these large nationwide investor-owned utilities, to what extent and I recognize none of you are technically on the policy side, right? That's where the legislature plays the role in this. But to what extent is there concern about competition between states, right? So if Veolia or American Water or Aqua is looking at 2 or 3 different acquisitions and they have opportunities for acquisitions in different states, to what extent do you think some of this fair market value legislation might influence the choice of where to invest, and how might that affect things between states? And I'll open that up to anybody who might have a thought on that. I know that one's a little bit out of left field from where we started.
There are a couple of points there. One, the investors would look, or our company would look at the just general regulatory environment in a particular state. The opportunity to earn on the acquisition. The other issue is there's only so much money available for acquisitions. So you have to kind of balance all of that, because obviously if it's a fair market value, that takes more money. Whether you can earn it or not, it takes more money. So you have to consider all of those different things.
Good.
Yeah, so just quickly, Michael. So I certainly understand that. I mean, I was just looking at my notes. I mean, there's been about $900 million invested in the first 20 applications or orders under fair market value. And that's by 3 companies, the largest ones in Pennsylvania, and I think the largest multi-state companies. I would guess, I haven't done this, but I would guess if you look at the states in which the large investor-owned companies operate in, many of them probably have fair market value legislation. And at least it's my understanding that in some of their shareholder investor calls, this is a growth strategy. So I assume that, I agree with what Gary said, they want to invest where they're going to get the best return, but it does seem to be a growth strategy that they're using among the various states they're operating in.
Commissioner, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Christine was saying makes a lot of sense. I know, looking at my notes, it looks like there's 12 states that have enacted fair market value acquisition policies, and I'd assume that probably the larger utilities that's gonna be their service territories for the most part. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I heard I think Christine alluded also to the sewer water sharing issue of basically having the water customers subsidize the acquisition of sewer, which I think is Pennsylvania's had that for a couple of years, and it just passed in Indiana this past session. And I know that is kind of a new angle on this acquisition topic that you could probably talk about too, as a growth strategy. But it's definitely there's something there to talk about.
Well, that's come up a couple of times, so let's talk about that. So what are some of these issues as we see this move legislatively, at least in your 2 states, and I don't know how many others, to allow wastewater costs to be allocated to water customers, knowing that those aren't always entirely the same folks. So what are some of the challenges there in terms of how to best structure the cost allocation to get the desired rate structures?
I'm happy to go first on this one, but so we've had with section 1311 of our public utility code since 2012. And originally it was used, again, more in that traditional regionalization and consolidation in transaction, because the water companies had much smaller customer groups on the wastewater side than they do on the water. So you could acquire a smaller, say, troubled system wastewater, and if you had multiples of those acquisitions, which they tended to have, you could shift some of those wastewater costs, if you could show it was in the public interest, to water customers. It wouldn't make much of an impact, but that was a point of negotiation in every rate case. The problem with applying that statute then post 2016, after we have the fair market value, is I think often the seller municipalities think that that's what's going to be used to prevent their constituents from having rate increases or having much of a rate increase. And while that may be true in theory, when you get into the rate case, they're still proposing to shift those dollars, but the dollars to be shifted are much bigger than they used to be. So we have situations where in one case, I think about 25% of the total increase that water customers got was due to the shift of wastewater to the water customers. So that's a lot, because those water customers have their own wastewater. They may be customers of the same system, but they may have a municipal system, they may have a septic system on their own property. So it really does call, all the cost causation things that we normally think about in rate making sort of go out the window. And there's a spectrum, of course, from no shift to everything shifted. And of course, no one wants to get to that spot, but finding the right spot in between is very difficult in rate cases.
Gary, can you chime in from the other side of the coin, and then I'll ask the commissioner kind of to find the balancing point for us.
Yeah, well, like Christine was saying, a lot of times the sewer operations, even if they also have our water, they're very small, and they're not connected. So each one has its own treatment plant. So it gets very expensive if you have to put those investment dollars on that small group of customers. Even if it was the water, even if you had water and sewer, and the sewer improvements also went to that small group of water customers, you're still looking at big increases. And as we move towards more consolidation across the country, there needs to be a way to do this, especially if you're in a larger water company, a lot of customers, the impact of shifting some sewer revenue requirement to water would be probably minimal on the water customers, and helps balance the increases on the sewer customers.
Commissioner?
Yeah, and I hear what Gary's saying, and I obviously spreading the cost across a bigger customer base it's going to help minimize it. As a utility commissioner, I'm just picturing sitting at a field hearing or some other event, having the public say, why am I subsidizing a customer on the other side of the state? And as far as paying that portion of their bill. So it's definitely, I think it's a point where there's a balance that it'll be interesting to see and how it's stricken in the long term. We haven't had it applied yet in Indiana, so I haven't got to see it firsthand.
Yeah, Commissioner, just following up, that gets into the whole single tariff pricing issue. When you try and say, well, you're not getting that investment now, but when you do, because you're going to need it, then everybody's paying for that and not just you. So I think that's the follow-up answer.
Well, so I agree if it's water to water, wastewater to wastewater, but when it's wastewater to water, I don't have an investor-owned utility as my wastewater, so I'm never going to get a benefit on my wastewater side of my bill from subsidizing. So that's the kind of thing you hear at public input hearings,
right?
In the rate cases, and as it goes bigger and bigger, it becomes more and more of an issue.
So we've hit on a few of these things, and we have a few minutes left before we move to the Q&A. One of the topics that came up earlier in our preparatory conversations was around the issue of CapEx and making sure that these promises come in and the investments are actually made, and figuring out, Gary, you mentioned that in assessing potential acquisitions, part of the investor question is how much do we actually have to put into this, right? Not just how much do we have to pay to buy it, but how much are we going to have to invest? How do companies go about estimating that need in the first place? How does that factor into their perception of the acquisition cost? And then on the other side, how do we, once these acquisitions are made, what can we do, or do we need to do anything to ensure that the investments actually happen and that they happen in a timely way?
Well, before, when you're looking at an acquisition, you go out in the field and do due diligence on what they actually have and what condition it's in. And that kind of helps our engineers figure out what needs to be done to get it operating properly. And I'm not talking about a distress system, because that gets even worse. But a decent operating system still may need improvements over the next 5-10 years. So that gets done. Then if the acquisition's successful and you start operating it, you may find that some of the CapEx you thought you needed, maybe you could combine a couple of those projects into one, which cuts the cost down. But to verify that it's done, you could either certify it at some point if you had to. Most of the bigger companies like ours, you'll be filing rate cases periodically. So during that process is also how you could certify what got done.
Christine or Commissioner Valletta, either of you have experience with this from the other side of the coin?
I don't have a
Well-
lot. Go ahead.
No,
Christine.
go ahead.
I don't have a, I'm sorry. I don't have a lot of concern with the investment happening. I think that with the incentive, they have the incentive to do the acquisitions, and then with the rate making treatment they have available to them, I don't have concern with the actual investment in the system happening. That really isn't my perspective. I haven't seen anything to be concerned about that.
I was just going to add that what we try and do in the cases, starting with the application case, is to get the companies to commit that the commitments that are embedded in the asset purchase agreement for these CapEx over 5 or 10 years don't displace their existing long-term infrastructure commitments to other customers. So it would be in addition to, not in place of. So we get that usually as part of the application case. And then, we take a look in the rate cases as well. But I agree, usually getting them to spend the dollars is usually not an issue. But again, it does raise that fairness issue, because sometimes those customers are still not paying their cost of service. So other customers are picking that up. So it just exacerbates some of the fairness issues we've already discussed.
Oh, no.
To what extent, if any, does the CapEx coming into rate base differ based on whether it's fair market valuation or not? I mean, if there's more of this upfront cost in terms of the valuation of the system, does that affect the way CapEx is evaluated for future rate base? Or if it's not a fair market value acquisition, does the fact that does that change the way in which the CapEx may be evaluated in terms of coming into rate base down the road?
So I don't think it really does. The only thing I would note is Pennsylvania's fair market value statute allows depreciation to be deferred on those capital expenditures until the first rate case. So that's different than normal non-fair market value acquisitions, and allows the accrual of AFUDC to continue if they're using it on those particular CapEx for up to 4 years, or again, that first rate case. So it makes a few tweaks to normal capital expenditures that we see in other settings.
Okay. Gary or Commissioner Valletta, have you seen anything along those lines?
I would say that I'm not sure about the depreciation or the AFUDC, but I don't think that it constrains what's going to happen when they come in for a rate case and in future cost recovery. So I don't think it really, the fair market value statute doesn't impact those CapEx.
Okay.
I don't think on the future CapEx needs that there's any issue. Just like if we're doing it with our existing company, it's just projects that have to get done.
So the last big question before we get to the Q&A, it came up or was referenced a little bit earlier. We're looking at some potentially interesting and challenging regulations around water quality, especially in the form of PFAS and PFOA regulations. To what extent do you think that is going to exacerbate or affect this trend? Is it going to change the conversation in terms of the cost allocation conversations, the rate increases? And what are some tools for dealing with what those consequences might look like?
I think it's gonna drive more acquisitions, because I think you have small systems that are gonna have these costs. And I don't think this is new technology that they're gonna have to use to deal with the PFAS, for example, but it's gonna be an added cost. And whether they're gonna want to incur those costs or sell the utility to a bigger entity that maybe can take that on. I think it's going to drive more acquisitions. I also feel kind of the same way. Our staff talks a lot about the operator shortage. And so if you're a small system and you're having to spend more to get an operator to come in because there's so few available, at some point it becomes cost prohibitive to spread that cost among such a small customer base. And then it'll weigh in favor of maybe selling. So I think all these things are going to kind of continue that issue. And I understand the PFAS issue specifically is like a regional thing where certain parts of the country, utilities have more exposure to it. And I guess this is all assuming that the utilities end up having to like bear the cost of the PFAS issue. And I don't know if like the companies responsible for putting this stuff into the utility system are going to share some of those costs somehow. But like, there is the EPA proposed rule that's out there. There's utilities are starting to figure out what their exposure to it is. And I just can't imagine it doesn't cause some smaller systems to want to no longer have to deal with that issue.
I think Commissioner said it all. It's what's going to happen. And obviously just PFAS is going to be large increases. Unless the feds do something to either help companies or go after the companies that cause the problem.
And some of that's being done on the private sector side between water companies and companies that are creating, these PFAS and PFOA contamination issues in the first place, I know. But so far, I don't think we've seen any resolution on those cases yet, have we? Or anyone familiar with those?
I don't think so.
I think there was a settlement announced in the South Carolina multi-party litigation, but I don't know. I think that was a couple of weeks ago. I will say so I think it probably will drive some consolidation. Again, I'm harping back to rates, but the cost for the investor-owned systems to make the same capital expenditures to treat PFOA, PFAS will be higher by definition than it would if a municipality did it, right? And they don't always, the investor-owned, especially on wastewater, I know that's not PFOA, PFAS, but they don't always have the same access to funding that the municipal systems do. So in the layering of the fair market value acquisitions, and then layering on top of that, all the things that water and wastewater companies have to do to comply with emerging contaminants and new rules, what I'm seeing as the ratepayer advocate is higher and higher increased costs, in which case, it would be great if the water and wastewater companies could focus on meeting those requirements, which of course they will do. But then maybe the acquisition costs could come down a little bit to offset those increased costs for complying with federal and state regulations.
Fantastic. So we do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go through some of those, and I'll allow any of you to respond as may make sense. The first one, though, I think, Christina, is going to be aimed at you. Has the Pennsylvania Commission ever decided that the acquired customer base must pay rates based on their own cost of service? Or do they typically allow the acquired company customers to be integrated with the existing customers for rate-making purposes? If so, what prompted that decision?
Good question. I don't know that we have any acquired customer base that's currently paying its full cost of service, because of course you have to consider gradualism and rate shock. So even paying less than full cost of service, some of these customers have seen very large increases in their bills. So the commission often has used single tariff pricing in the water wastewater field for 35, 40 years. So that's really their basis for taking the costs that aren't being covered by the acquired customer base and spreading those to other customers. So even within the wastewater side, which is where most of the acquisitions have been in Pennsylvania, wastewater customers are subsidizing others sort of in that single tariff pricing model that Gary mentioned. So that part has been around for a long time, but eventually the acquired customer base will pay its full cost of service. It gets a little harder after the first rate case because have not been required to have a separate cost of service study after the first base rate case. So it makes it very hard to figure out then what the cost of service is for each of the acquired customer bases.
I want to back up a step based on something that you just said. And you mentioned this earlier, that these acquisitions have been going on for a long time. Over the course of your career, you've seen the consolidation from over 400 to about 100 systems in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned earlier. And yet this conversation about acquisitions seems to be kind of a hot topic, which is why we're doing this webinar. What's changed? Why is this? Why in our current environment does this seem to be more of a point of contention, point of discussion, kind of a more pressing issue?
Well, I think it comes down to the dollars. So I have a chart for the first 20 cases. I said they spent about $906 million, they being the large investor-owned systems, to acquire 20 systems. The depreciated original cost, which I'll come back to, is about $447 million. So you're seeing the multiples over depreciated original cost. And as I think we talked about earlier, that's depreciated original cost that doesn't remove contributions or anything like that under the way it's defined under our fair market value statute. So they create a depreciated original cost because most likely the real depreciated original cost would be close to zero, right? So even taking that 1329 fair market value depreciated original cost, we're seeing multiples of about two times the cost, and that has a huge rate impact. And I think that's why you're seeing it. Now, there's also some growing grassroots involvement here in Pennsylvania with some customers, especially in the southeastern portion of the state, organizing and actively opposing the sale of their municipal wastewater system to an investor-owned utility. That's not part of what we do. We deal with whatever case is presented in front of the PUC, but there's a huge impact on rates, and there's also the growing sort of local activity as well.
Okay.
So I think follow up on the question, Michael. I think this started years ago when the whole discussion started with replacing aging infrastructure, looking at over $1 trillion nationwide. And then, so you start there, then you add on lead, then you had the contaminant issues that we're currently facing with PFAS. So I think it's a multiple of reasons why we're seeing more.
Okay. Anything to add on that, Commissioner?
Yeah, so in Indiana, since the utility acquisition legislation passed, the average cost that the acquiring utility pays per customer being acquired has increased almost 2.5 times. So in 8 cases prior to the passage of the acquisition legislation, the average price per customer was approximately $2,500. And since the legislation passed, the price is approximately $6,000. So our staff's analysis was this increases price is likely attributed in part to the inclusion of the donated property in the appraisal, and that amount just keeps going up. So I think that is putting a lot of pressure, upward pressure on this.
Okay. So another question from the Q&A. Is it possible to reconcile the fair market value method of valuing an acquisition in state legislation with the method of valuing utility assets described in the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Hope Natural Gas and in Bluefield Waterworks? It seems like fair market value will always greatly exceed Hope and Bluefield. Are any of you familiar enough with the decision in Hope and Bluefield to kind of respond to that idea?
Well, I'll give a quick answer. I think one of the ways to do it is that you would have a different fair rate of return on the fair market value assets, right? So it has to be a fair rate of return, but if the assets are above depreciated original cost, then maybe that's one way to reconcile the returns that are given on the fair market value rate base compared to what may be given on the depreciated original cost.
So with that thought, would you think on that acquired company, you'd have actually 2 different rate of returns?
I
One
think
on the original costs and one on the difference between that fair market?
I mean, it hasn't happened here, Gary. I mean, I think that's certainly one way to approach it, because I think, you know, if you argue that the return overall should be lowered because they're using fair market value, then I think you potentially get into challenges that they're not getting a fair return on the investor dollars in that depreciated cost rate base. But in the fair market value, you know, again, you might have an argument for that. I'll let the academics worry about that and figure that out. I don't know that we've decided to approach that yet in a case. And again, these are my comments, not the office's, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Are there any concerns? Are there concerns that how fair value is determined creates no incentive to result in a conservative value? You referred to this earlier, Christine. You know, neither the seller nor the buyer has a strong incentive for a minimally priced sale. So, you know, given that, is that what the legislation has attempted to address? Are there other ways of addressing this? How is that taken care of?
Well, in Pennsylvania, it isn't currently. I mean, there's discussion on the legislative front about whether there should be amendments to 1329, and certainly that would be a possibility, that you would have some kind of sort of cap on the acquisition price under fair market value. But you know, again, that's just discussion in the legislature at this point.
Commissioner?
Yeah, and I would just say the same thing Christine said about the cap. I've read that idea came up. There's a Scott Hempling article about water mergers. Are they making economic sense? They wrote back in 2019 when he proposes the idea of the cap, and he talks about what's the incentive. Yeah, both sides want to get a higher price. You know, the seller wants to get the highest price possible. If the buyer is going to put it on the rate base, how does that make economic sense? And I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to get into that. But if you read Scott's essay, it's interesting to think about, but it's all, you know, at this point it's talk. It's not, there's legislation pending here.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to the extent that the fair market value gets capitalized into the rate base, then you're right. Everybody wants a higher price, right? Which is not the way we normally think about markets working, right? So we're trying to divide the gains from trade between the two parties. in this sense, the pie gets bigger as both sides, work together to increase the size of the pie just by raising the price, right? So it does, there is a perverse incentive in this system in some sense if fair market value is allowed to be built into the rate base directly. So it will be interesting to track this over time and see how things go. So a question for you, Commissioner, while we're here. Do your commissions, we'll start with you. Do your commissions use any metrics to help gauge whether an acquisition is reasonable, like rate base per acquired customer you referred to earlier, compared to rate base per existing customer? Are there other criteria that the commissions might use as a metric to evaluate whether the acquisition is reasonable?
Okay, I'm going to try to tap dance around this. So we have a statute that very clearly gives us, it gives us things we can consider. And so I think it would depend on the statutory scheme in that particular jurisdiction. Ours is one that it gives us things to weigh to try to come up with what things for us to consider. And as part of is our role in reviewing the evidence and making findings in a case, but it really, there's not something I can recommend. That's just not, like I said before, I'm a policy taker in Indiana. But if you look at our statute, you look at Pennsylvania statute, I think you'll see and kind of look at the, I believe there's an NRRI document that's out there that kind of compares the different jurisdictions. You can kind of get a flavor for the different elements of each state and what it looks like, and maybe what a state with a little more discretion would look like, one with less discretion on the regulated side.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, in Pennsylvania, at least 20 cases in, I have to say that each case is unique. So I think it's really hard to come up with a bright line test. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's sort of hard to do that because what may be a relatively small acquisition may have a bigger impact on those smaller group of customers. So it's just been very difficult. I think in 2016, we thought by now we would be able to do that, but we haven't been able to figure that out at this point.
Gary?
I can't speak for the commissions, but they have to assure that the company buying the other company has the financial strength in order to do it, that they can provide good quality service, good customer service, all those things that a utility should be providing. Because if they can't, then the acquisition shouldn't go through.
Okay. We are about out of time, so I'm going to give you a quick round robin of 2 minutes each to kind of summarize what are the key takeaways and where do we go from here?
Well, I'll go ahead. I mean, so as I said earlier, I mean, acquisitions can create efficiencies, lower operation and maintenance expenses per customer, and reduce the number of poor performing water and wastewater utilities. And so that's what we've seen. As Christine pointed out, I mean, it started out with the small and troubled systems, and now we're sort of, those have been mostly, I think, a lot of those have been dealt with, and I'm sure there's probably still some there. But there's a lot of challenges. I think in Indiana, we don't have, I should say in some states, you have two similar sized utilities competing for acquisitions. And so that may make the challenges different in each state, and also just geography and a lot of other things that are factoring into it, whatever jurisdiction you're in. So I think it makes it challenging, and it's not as simple as just putting on a number and saying this is the number that it should be. These are the amount of customers and things like that. It's really going to vary state by state, case by case.
Christine.
Yeah, I will again say, we take these cases as they come in to the commission, but the rate harms are really what we're most concerned about. That's driven by that fair market valuation of the rate making rate base. I think there's ways to do fair market value acquisitions that are not having such a huge rate impact. So I think that's certainly a pathway to move forward under the fair market valuation statute. But for most part on the cases we've seen so far, that has it, the rate impact has been pretty large. Sometimes we can find our way to say there are enough affirmative benefits, but that's really the challenge that we see in each of these cases.
Gary?
Well, I think there has to be some recognition across the country that consolidation is the way to go. Everybody says yes, but then sometimes with some of the acquisitions, especially original cost, and you pay something more than original cost, depreciated original cost, that there has to be some recognition that that price, within reason, should be earned on, because we all agree that consolidation is the way to go in the long run.
Very good. Well, thank you all for your time today and for your comments. This has been wonderful. As a reminder, we will have this, this has been recorded, except for the first few seconds there, we had a technical glitch, but this will be up on our YouTube page later today or tomorrow. And I'll also provide a link to the slides that Christine referred to. Our next Hot Topic hotline is scheduled for July 31st, noon Central Time. Dr. Carly Stedman, a senior economist at the Kansas City Fed, is going to talk about her perspectives on monetary policy and inflation and interest rates. And we'll have some industry folks to respond to that. So look for registration information on that to come up soon. FRI's flagship program, our fall symposium on September 20th, we'll be talking more about some of these issues in a broader context around critical infrastructure in natural gas, electricity, and water, and discussing some of the issues in planning, developing projects, and securing physical infrastructure around our critical infrastructure facilities in these industries. So follow us at fri.missouri.edu online, or look for at FRI_news on Twitter to follow along. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you all so much for your time and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.